Welcome to Energy Insights. Today we're speaking with Farwa Aamer about all things women, energy and climate change. Farwa is the Director of South Asia Initiatives at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. Prior to this, she led research on security, political and socio-economic dimensions of transboundary river governance in the Himalayan region, along with other issues revolving around water, energy, climate change and sustainable development across South Asia. Today, we spoke about many topics that included climate change and its disproportionate impacts on women, energy poverty and the impacts of energy poverty, the just energy transition in the context of women, how women can play a larger role in addressing climate change and energy issues, and what barriers still exist for women in terms of climate and energy policy. It was great speaking with Farwa, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Okay, so we are here with Farwa Aamer. Farwa, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
So before we get started, Farwa, I'm just wondering if you can give us a brief background on who you are and anything relevant to say the career that you've worked on, or any experiences that you think might be relevant to this conversation that we'll talk about on women's issues and climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, I'm Farwa Aamer. I'm the Director for South Asia Initiatives at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York, where my work is to oversee all the research and policy work that comes out of the Institute focused on the South Asia region, not only looking at the traditional security sets impacting the region, but also the non-traditional security issues impacting the region, which include, of course, climate and water and energy security. So this is very well within my alley of work. But prior to that, I've been a part of other think tanks where I've done similar work, not only looking at South Asia holistically, but also looking at sustainable development. Water security is an area of deep interest for me, transboundary resources, and the competition and policy and diplomacy around it has been something that I've been working on for a while. But amidst all of that, the idea of gender and how that nexus is with climate change and water security and water scarcity has been something that I've been very passionate about and been following and writing on, at least for the past couple of years. So, that is exactly why I think this conversation is meaningful and why I'm excited to have this discussion with you today.
So I think a good place to actually start on that note is why climate change in a general sense, is important in the context of women. What for you are, I guess, the big differences between the impacts on men and the impacts on women when it comes to climate change? Why is it so much more important for women in this case?
Right. It's a critical question, right? Climate change impacts all. We've seen that, but it disproportionately impacts women and young children. The vulnerability to climate change, and as we've seen it in recent times, is just being exacerbated by the inequity and the marginalization that is linked to gender, income groups, ethnicity, and other social, cultural and economic factors. So that, I think, pretty much sets the stage for why climate change is a bit of a major factor in the lives of women today. Gender inequality, especially the kind of climate crisis we've seen in the developing world, where gender inequality is a little bit higher, is perhaps together one of the greatest challenges of our time. It poses threats to ways of life and livelihoods and health and safety and security of women and young girls today, but also future generations, because that's how women are the pioneers for the future generation. And if you just look at different elements and explore different factors, women worldwide are more dependent on natural resources. Yet they have less access to them compared to men. Since you talked about the comparison of how this impacts women impacts in comparison to their male counterparts, and in agriculture alone, for instance, women make up nearly half of the labor force in developing countries, but due to climate change and the challenges and the change in weather patterns, like droughts and erratic rainfall patterns, there have been disproportionate impacts on women's ability to secure these resources while working in the agricultural sector, often forcing them to work harder to sustain their families. Speaking from a water security perspective, and in terms of, how water scarcity and the growing insecurity is impacting the lives of women in comparison to their male counterparts also, you'll see women on the front lines there as well. Women are primary caregivers in much of these rural households and in developing countries in many of these communities. And many of them walk miles every day. They spend about, 200 hours per day, just like 200 million hours per day, just trying to go and fetch water and come back. And that's a heavy load and compromises their educational, employment, and other opportunities, whatever else they could do with that time. So that's something to really consider when you're looking at how much of an impact women are experiencing because of the intensifying situation around climate change. Even with the natural disasters or climate-related disasters, women are hit harder. There are studies, but there's also evidence from recent times that women are more likely to experience gender-based violence in the aftermath of disasters. They also face greater challenges accessing healthcare services, which of course leads to increased risk, whether it's their own health or the maternal health and child health. When Pakistan experienced floods in 2022, there were about 75,000 women who were ready to give birth in 3 months' time when the floods hit them, and they were displaced. They didn't have the right medical resources or healthcare facilities, and many of them actually had to give birth next to the rubble of their house and their homes. And that's a real challenge, and that really paints a grim picture because it's not too far off. It's 2022 we are talking about. And but that's one example. And you look at others like extreme heat, the kind, the Middle East and South Asia and Africa have been experiencing. They all can link to a rise in stillbirth rates, or you can look at how climate change-related vector-borne diseases can pose additional threats to the health of women and young children. So that really, I think, and like I said, it's worrisome. And what's unfortunate is that even though the level of policy discourse in terms of adding gender or talking about women has improved over the years, but it's still not there at the required stages as yet. I mean, you need to integrate actively gender perspectives into climate policies more and more, in even disaster risk reduction strategies. And it comes with a whole lot of factors, which I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about deeper into the conversation.
Yeah, you mentioned now, you've given us just with those wonderful examples about how climate change impacts women more, you've given us some examples of how this happens in for example, you mentioned South Asia and Africa, of course. And now I'm just wondering if there are significant differences between, say, developed countries and developing countries. Now, there are the obvious differences in, for example, incomes. But are there any particular themes that you could speak to on how climate change impacts women?
Yeah, what you've pointed out, right? The income disparity exists, and that has led to a number of stark differences in how these climate change impacts vary between what we see in the developed world versus the developing world. But what we witness now is that climate change is now a global phenomenon. It's just not limited to one part of the world or one hemisphere. In the last 2 years, especially, we have witnessed prolonged droughts in the Middle East and North Africa, erratic monsoons in South Asia, record-breaking heat waves in Europe. In the United States, you see the impacts as well. So the climate change kind of globally now cause humanitarian and socio-economic havoc. And so what we're seeing is that climate crisis is unraveling on the planet much faster than formerly perceived. And it's not just a developing world challenge anymore, especially if you add the mix of whole energy and food security into it and connect it to the global crisis that's going on geopolitically otherwise. So while that is there, and that I think is a common thread, that it's not just something, the looming specter for the developed world, it's very much in existence, and there is no discrimination in how climate change is approaching the world. But in terms of impact, the stark disparity emerges exactly from that, the income differences. And which reveals a disconcerting truth, which is that the world's most impoverished nations shoulder a burden they scarcely contributed to. The carbon footprint pales in comparison to that of their more affluent counterparts. Yet paradoxically, in these very communities, they bear the brunt of the climate change a lot more than the developed world. And the developing world also holds in a population which has a giant chunk of female population, youth population, a burgeoning youth population. So you see those impacts then trickle down and impact women. So women who are part of say the marginalized communities sitting in South Asia, sitting in Africa, and MENA, who are already faced with a number of gender inequalities in their daily lives, who are dealing with patriarchal barriers, cultural barriers, religious barriers, are not empowered economically, do not have the right kind of financial resources as, say, their counterparts in the developed world might. So, which means that their adaptability or their resilience towards climate change is much lower, and that's the case you see. That's the difference that needs to be somewhat a barrier that needs to be built and resolved.
Yeah, now, at least for me, one thing that is a stark difference too between, say, developed and developing countries is of course the access to energy, and what I now want to talk about is this term energy poverty. I'm just wondering what that means to you, and what, if you can give us an overview of what energy poverty means for you, and why is energy in particular so important for women in developing countries?
Yeah, I mean, the concept of energy poverty, it is lack of access to sustainable, modern energy services and products, right? And the way the world is developing or is required to develop, if you look at SDGs and other goals set internationally, energy is present, and it's strongly and constantly kind of intertwined with set communities, countries, regions, economic and social development. So the poorer the country, the less equipped they will be with energy services. And that is where the differences arise, and that's where the challenge arises. So how we talked about water and security challenges, climate change, which are all, well, by the way, are interconnected. So it's a vicious cycle. The nexus of water, food, energy is very real. So energy poverty also hits the vulnerable the hardest. And when we talk about the vulnerable, we're talking about the marginalized groups in the society, and women stand out, and especially when we talk about the poorer countries and the developing world. Women in these poorer countries or developing countries, especially those in the rural centers, as not as much as the urban centers, but that's really not a big difference if you look at some of the regions today, especially those that are economically not doing that well. Women are the main consumers of energy in the household. It is by social norms or cultural norms that they're responsible for all the, your daily chores, whether it's cooking or washing or cleaning. And so they are constantly being exposed, and they don't have that access to clean and reliable energy resources that, we talk about elsewhere in the world. They resort to using these traditional biomass fuels, or they're using like the wood and charcoals, or in some parts of the world, like dung for cooking. And they all can lead to serious health risks, which, of course, could be by way of indoor air pollution. It can lead to severe asthma cases. It depends on what stage of what age the woman is. It's a pregnant woman, then of course, it impacts the child's health also. And so that's one area and one lens to look at, how energy poverty impacts the health and the lives of women, but also it impacts the livelihoods of women. When you're dealing with you do not have the right modern energy resources, or you're dealing with sort of energy poverty, it hinders women's economic empowerment as well, because they don't have the access to modern energy services that might, allow for them to think of or be a part of income generating opportunities or activities. When you don't have stable electricity supply, you might not be able to use internet, or you might properly, or you can't engage in, say, small scale businesses or use set appliances. And It impacts communication. And so all of that kind of factors in as well.
Yeah, it reminds me too with, you mentioned this idea of a vicious cycle between multiple impacts. And I think energy plays a big role in that too. When you think about, example for a heat wave, not having access to, reliable energy can obviously hinder your, access to, say, an air conditioner or a fan at the very least, right? And then that can lead on to, several other issues that affect the woman who is, as you mentioned, in some cultures confined to, household duties. And normally those households are quite small and cramped, and ventilation is not the best. And I guess this kind of ties into this idea of a just energy transition. And I just wanted to get your opinion on this and what does a just energy transition mean for you and, of course, women in general?
The idea behind just energy transition is a positive one. It's a meaningful one where you're like, okay, as the world is transitioning to net zero, how do we maximize the benefits of climate action and this green transition, and minimize the negative impacts of workers and their communities and whatnot. But the way it is done, just could mean so many things. It could be just in terms of underrepresented and vulnerable communities, just in terms of richer countries versus poorer countries, those who are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions versus those who are not, and on the receiving end of the climate change impacts. But for women in general, if you look at it, it all ties down to some of the areas that we've already touched upon. It's just because how women are generally in a weaker position of power, whether it's economically or whether it's just socially or culturally. This just energy transition concept also becomes something that they're unfortunately not at the winning end of, let's just put it that way. Say, in the fossil fuel producing countries, just energy transition would require workers to be compensated by the governments and companies who are moving to phasing down or moving to renewables, for example. But because men would account more of the workforce and women would account for less of that, you would automatically see men just being on the higher end of the compensation and women not so much. And so, you would come back and think that how do you make this compensation more equitable, or how do you allow for job conversion to happen to ensure that women are compensated rightly or correctly. And that's what I believe APEC had also proposed, is that women should be stakeholders when these plans are being jotted out. And that beckons this whole entire conversation and this approach where you demand women's full and equitable participation from the very get-go in the process of just energy transition. You involve them in the formulation and the implementation and the monitoring and in the evaluation of these policies and programs. So you're catering to a really to hold this dynamic, whether they're part of active workforce or in traditional sectors or non-traditional sectors, or how are you contributing to their well-being. And being sensitive to gender policy scenarios, I think that's something that increasingly needs to be looked at when we talk about the concept of just energy transition, and something that the countries are moving towards and edging towards more and more. And climate finance is another area which comes in when you speak of just energy transition, is that climate finance should also support countries and companies in carrying out these planning processes and implementation processes where you're leveraging gender equality and women's representation.
Do you think there's been much progress globally on women's representation in just energy transitions, or do you think we're still moving a little too slowly?
I think I would always want to see conversations around this to be moving faster than what we are at, because, the time for discourse and all is gone. We have to be proactive, and we're in that phase where we need to be dealing with solutions head on. And if you look at the kind of crises that is unfolding and the projections that are in the world, you're probably off slower than what you should be, or at a phase at step one or a phase back where you would rather be, just to keep up with the challenges that are right in front of us. So there is progress, but there's room for greater progress. There's room for greater inclusion of women. There's room for getting a more holistic and an inclusive and representative just energy transition process on the ground in all parts of the world where there is room for it.
Now, you did mention solutions earlier, and I did want to now shift into that kind of area. And I'm just wondering what your views are on how important this perspective from women is on any kind of solution, whether that be a climate solution or an energy solution, because I think right now we're seeing we're still seeing developments in the world where, for example, I'm sure you know about, the COP29 committee recently, or when they first initially announced it, was all men. And that doesn't really show, or at least to my eyes, it doesn't really show much progress on, the highest level of where, say, a climate negotiation or where climate policy is made. So I'm just wondering how important is that view from women in regards to those kind of areas, but also other areas as well?
I think there's a need for higher women representation in all sectors of policy, period, from peace building to climate change. I think women are on the front lines of fighting climate change. They're also on the front lines in a number of conflict-prone areas, whether it's like negotiating or whether they are fighting for their communities or their families. And they need to be more and more involved in how decisions around them or, decisions that impact them, they need to be involved within that decision-making process. They cannot just be bystanders, and they have to be active stakeholders. They have to take active participation. Half of the world's population is comprised of women and young girls, yet they're still left out, left out of the conversation when it comes to particularly like climate change, because we're talking about it right now, especially if you look at indigenous women, in particular, they are the forefront of environmental conservation, and they have invaluable knowledge and expertise, and you can really leverage that by including them as stakeholders, and they can help build resilience. They can give you the technical know-how. They can help policymakers. They can help other stakeholders to come together with and to work on a better sort of climate action for their communities, and then on starting from local level, help sort of lead to a way that can impact like the provincial level, state level, what have you, and up to the national level. They can set the stage for best practices and allow for a more sustainable and equitable future for all. I love to give this example that there is a way you can make women part of the solution, and Jordan has done that. Somebody who has been looking at water for a while. This example makes me very happy, but a couple of years ago, Jordan basically has water insecurity, and it has a notorious problem of leakages through the pipes. So a lot of water before it gets to the households gets leaked through the pipelines because of their the rugged system. But what they did was the Ministry of Water Resources in Jordan, I believe in collaboration with a development partner, they started training women to be plumbers. So they didn't have to wait for, say, a plumber to come, which is obviously high in demand and short on supply. They could just solve and resolve the problem and challenge at home. And it also gave them a way to not only feel empowered that, yes, they can fix something that's broken, but also gave them a way of employment. Because they started, actively becoming a part of that workforce, and plumbing became an occupation for them. It's something that helped empower them economically. So I think there are many such examples where you found solutions like this being implemented and women being active part of climate action. And that's where, you can employ similar strategies when it comes to energy, similar strategies when it comes to food, make them more involved and aware when it comes to climate smart agricultural technologies and what they can do with those. So there are many ways you can help allow for a better environment, which is more inclusive, more representative, and that will just not benefit the generation now, but the generations to come.
And what kind of barriers do you think are still in existence for women to play a larger role, Farwa? Do you think that these still exist significantly in some areas?
Yes, I mean, you look at I'm from South Asia. I was born and raised in South Asia, and somebody who comes from Asia, comes from that part of the world. I've seen those barriers, and I know many of these barriers still persist. And these are the cultural barriers that the regions have had and been prone to and vulnerable for years, which unfortunately are patriarchal in nature. They do not allow for women to have the space or the freedom of movement in some places, freedom of speech in others. They're just resigned to roles as domestic caregivers, as women who raise kids and women who look after the elderly. That's what their roles are limited to. There are religious barriers, of course. Many of them are just resigned to certain positions, or just resigned to spots indoors, or just remain in women-only circles, because their religious norms don't allow them to be actively out there in the world with the male counterparts. And these barriers still, exist. There are concerns with their safety and security, women becoming active part of the workforce, or being out and about traveling. All of these, there are risks of gender-based violence, trafficking, still, unfortunately, incidents of harassment and rapes, and all of these are existent, and you see and read reports of it on the daily. So this kind of also hinders and somewhat demotivates women in certain parts of the world, and this requires a larger systemic and structural change, where you've got to ensure that there is empowerment on many levels. I think economic empowerment gives a lot of freedom, but education starting with education is where your primary responsibility falls. I'm speaking to the governments and authorities in charge. That's where I think the real empowerment will begin.
Thanks so much for your time, Farwa. And I know we're hitting the hard wall. And I just had one last question for you. What would you like to see happen in the short-term future and the long-term future when it comes to women and energy and just climate impacts and solutions in general?
Well, I would ideally want to see a world that is actively pursuing goals that are favorable for the future generations to come, a safer climate, safer planet, and better climate action priorities, and acting on them in a manner that is not only diligent but also delivering on the commitments that so far feel very rhetorical in nature. But you need to be a little bit more actionable, and you want to see women in leadership positions. You want to be able to see them as leading climate negotiations, leading peace-building negotiations, and different parts of the world. You want to see women a lot more empowered. I genuinely, truly think that, whether it's Asia or the United States or the very part of the Western world, there are some brilliant examples of women leaders, and especially in politics and diplomacy, and also, in many ways, in other parts of the workforce and in different industries, who could be leading examples, and their stories are quite inspiring, that one could learn from, and how they've broken barriers. And women today are more cognizant, they're more empowered, and somewhat realize the need to take charge for their own futures and to be able to craft their own paths. So there is hope, but much more needs to be done. There needs to be more attention globally towards the challenges that are faced by women on the daily, and that's where we would like to see that in the international community jointly sees the need for attention in these areas and delivers on the commitments, and then holds individual governments accountable for that as well.
Well, thanks so much for your time, Farwa. It was really wonderful to talk to you. And just before we sign off, I'm just wondering if you could point listeners to where they could either follow your work or follow your organization's work. Are there any social media links or websites that you'd like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. Please follow our work at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And we're prominent and very much active on all social medias: Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. So follow us there. You can also follow me on LinkedIn and on Instagram. My Twitter handle is at FAAMER, and you can always look me up by my name on LinkedIn. But yeah, this has been a wonderful chat. Thank you for having me, Ashley.
If you found this episode valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends or colleagues, and visit our website at energytracker.asia for more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Energy Insights.